In the quiet town of San Bernardino, California, on January 30, 1930, Eugene Allen Hackman was born into a world already marked by hardship. His childhood was not the gilded dream of Hollywood, but the raw, unvarnished reality of a family that struggled to hold itself together. His father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, worked in newspaper circulation, but battled his own demons of instability. His mother, Anna, was a homemaker, trying to keep balance in a house already leaning toward collapse. When Gene was just 13, his father walked out, leaving behind a wound that never fully healed. The absence of a strong paternal figure cut deep, fueling a sense of abandonment that would haunt Hackman throughout his formative years. His school was no refuge. Hackman was restless, impatient, and by many accounts a poor student. He was dyslexic at a time when the condition wasn't understood, let alone accommodated. He struggled with reading, stumbled through assignments, and carried the shame of being labeled slow. But beneath the surface was a boy with a razor-sharp memory, a gift for mimicry, and a burning desire to escape his circumstances. At 16, he lied about his age to enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps. For Hackman, the Marines weren't simply about service. They were about escape, about proving he could be more than a fatherless boy written off by society. His years in uniform took him across China, Japan, and Hawaii, teaching him discipline, resilience, and the cold fact that the world was often cruel. Yet the military could not erase the creative fire inside him. When he returned to civilian life, Hackman drifted. He tried journalism, radio, and even store clerking, but nothing stuck. The dream of acting, a fragile, almost embarrassing ambition, began to gnaw at him. But even then, he was dismissed. At the Pasadena Playhouse, where he trained as an actor, instructors told him flatly, "You will never make it." They branded him too old-looking, too rough around the edges, too unsympathetic for audiences. His closest friend there, Dustin Hoffman, was told the same thing. Hackman later recalled, "They didn't just tell us we couldn't act, they made us believe we had no right to try." But Hackman's defining trait was defiance. The very rejection that crushed others only hardened him. He would not quit. He would not disappear into obscurity. Instead, he packed his bags for New York City, hungry, unpolished, but unwilling to surrender. New York in the late 1950s was a city of extremes, gritty, unforgiving, but alive with possibility. For Gene Hackman, still a young man with ambition but very little to show for it, the city became both a battleground and a proving ground. The skyline was a monument to dreams realized, but its streets were littered with stories of those who never made it. Hackman arrived knowing the odds were stacked against him. He was already approaching 30, older than most aspiring actors. His instructors at Pasadena had told him bluntly that he was wasting his time, that his face was too plain, his demeanor too hard, his talent not worth cultivating. But Hackman's stubbornness was legendary. If they said he couldn't, he would. If they insisted he was not leading man material, he would carve out a path of his own. The early years in New York were marked by hunger, literal and metaphorical. Hackman scraped by with odd jobs, clerking in stores, hauling equipment, doing whatever was necessary to pay rent on small, dingy apartments. He shared meals with fellow strugglers like Dustin Hoffman and Robert Duvall, all of them nobodies then, all of them clinging desperately to the idea that one day someone might notice them. Off-Broadway productions became Hackman's lifeline. He threw himself into roles that often paid little or nothing, but gave him a chance to refine his craft. He appeared in television bit parts, fleeting roles where his name never appeared in the credits, and sometimes in film jobs so minor they barely registered. Yet in those small appearances, a pattern emerged. There was something about Hackman's presence that audiences, directors, and casting agents couldn't ignore. He carried himself with a quiet intensity. He didn't soften his rough edges for the sake of likability. Where others strained to charm, Hackman remained authentic, even abrasive. That realism made him magnetic. Slowly, whispers began to circulate. There was this ex-Marine, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to bore straight through the screen. He wasn't handsome in the conventional Hollywood sense, but he was unforgettable. By the mid-1960s, Hackman's name began to reach the ears of serious filmmakers. His determination, coupled with undeniable talent, finally collided with opportunity. The turning point came with Bonnie and Clyde, 1967. Cast as Buck Barrow, the doomed brother of Clyde, Hackman delivered a performance that was equal parts human and terrifying. He played Buck not as a caricature of a criminal, but as a flesh-and-blood man, conflicted, weak, but deeply sympathetic. Critics immediately hailed him as a revelation. The Academy nominated him for Best Supporting Actor. The man who had been branded unfit for the profession just a decade earlier was suddenly standing among the brightest new stars of American cinema. The success was exhilarating, but behind closed doors, it carried a hidden cost. His marriage to Faye Maltese, whom he had married in 1956, was already strained by years of instability. Faye had been with him in the wilderness years, holding the family together as Hackman bounced between rejection and obscurity. She raised their children, kept food on the table, and shouldered the weight of domestic life, while Hackman chased an elusive dream that for so long had given little in return. When the recognition finally arrived, Faye might have hoped for relief, for stability at last, but what came instead was a darker, more complicated reality. Fame altered the balance of their relationship. Hackman's career demanded long absences from home, endless rehearsals, and total commitment. Faye, who had borne the sacrifices in silence for years, now faced a husband consumed by his craft. Success did not soothe Hackman, it sharpened his obsession. He pushed harder, worked longer, and demanded more from himself. At home, that intensity often translated into distance, impatience, and resentment. What had once been a marriage built on mutual endurance began to feel like a battlefield of control and unspoken anger. Financial pressures compounded the strain. Hollywood wealth, especially in the 1970s, was deceptive. Big paychecks came with agents' cuts, legal fees, taxes, and investments that often went sour. Hackman, not a man inclined to financial caution, found himself embroiled in lawsuits over contracts and stung by poor business choices. The lifestyle expected of a star, houses, cars, travel, exacerbated the issue. On screen, he was celebrated. At home, he wrestled with debts and obligations that threatened to undo the fragile stability his family had fought to maintain. By the early 1980s, the marriage was unraveling under the combined weight of emotional exhaustion and financial turmoil. Faye had endured nearly 30 decades of sacrifices, and the toll was clear. Insiders described the eventual divorce in 1986 as bitter, exhausting, and deeply painful. For Hackman, the separation carried a profound irony. The woman who had stood beside him through the leanest, darkest years was no longer there to share in the triumph of his peak. He had fought the world for success and won, but in the process, he lost the one who believed in him when almost no one else did. The period left scars. Hackman rarely spoke about the divorce in public, but those close to him noted that the bitterness lingered. He had gained the respect of critics, peers, and audiences worldwide, but his private life bore the marks of collateral damage. The great paradox of Hackman's rise was clear. The harder he pushed toward excellence, the more he sacrificed the fragile human connections that might have grounded him. The applause of millions could not silence the echo of a family fractured. Hackman's second act in love was no less turbulent than his first. In 1991, at the age of 61, he married Betsy Arakawa, a classical pianist, and a woman nearly 3 decades his junior. On the surface, it appeared a story of redemption, a man who had endured decades of struggle, a bitter divorce, and the loneliness of success, finally finding peace with someone who could offer stability and grace. For Hackman, older now, and carrying the weight of both fame and regret, Betsy represented a kind of refuge, a companion who seemed untouched by the brutal politics of Hollywood. She was refined, private, and dedicated to her own artistic pursuit of music. In many ways, they seemed to complete one another, the hardened, uncompromising actor and the gentle, disciplined pianist. But as history often shows, appearances rarely tell the full story. Behind the carefully managed public image, their marriage endured storms of its own. Hackman's reputation in Hollywood was complicated. To his peers, he was a genius, a performer who could transform himself so fully into a character that audiences forgot the man behind the role. But to directors, journalists, and even friends, he was often described as intimidating, quick-tempered, and difficult to please. That same marine-bred toughness and relentless impatience, which had driven him to the top of his profession, carried over into his private life. Rumors of Hackman's temper surfaced frequently in the press throughout the 1990s, with tabloid headlines suggesting that his sharp tongue and refusal to suffer fools extended far beyond the set. Betsy, often described in profiles as elegant, intelligent, and almost fiercely private, found herself thrust into a whirlwind. The world of a Hollywood star's spouse was not one of quiet dignity. It was one of constant scrutiny, whispers of scandal, and endless public attention. Paparazzi followed them during premieres and outings. Gossip columns speculated endlessly about the age difference, her role in taming Hackman, and whether the marriage could endure the chaos of celebrity life. Though Betsy had no taste for the limelight, she was drawn into it nonetheless, her name forever tied to one of the most uncompromising men in Hollywood. Addiction was not Hackman's personal demon, but it surrounded him. The industry in which he worked, an endless cycle of sets, premieres, and after-parties, was riddled with excess. Colleagues, friends, even rivals fell prey to drugs and alcohol, and the chaos of that culture inevitably seeped into their personal circle. For a woman like Betsy, who came from the disciplined world of classical music, the atmosphere was jarring. The couple's home life was tested not only by the constant intrusions of fame, but by the turbulent environment of the entertainment world itself. Hackman, for his part, was devoted to his work in a way that few could truly understand. Acting for him was never a hobby or a paycheck. It was a calling, an obsession. He demanded perfection of himself, and by extension, of those around him. He refused to soften his edges for comfort's sake. That drive, while responsible for some of the greatest performances in modern cinema, often left little room for the gentleness or compromise that sustains long-term intimacy. Betsy was not dealing with a man content to grow old quietly. She was married to a legend who lived every day with the intensity of a battlefield. And yet, unlike his first marriage, this one endured. Perhaps it was the timing. Hackman was older, no longer chasing validation, and had already achieved the accolades and wealth that once seemed impossible. Perhaps it was Betsy's quiet strength, her ability to withstand the public chaos without demanding the spotlight herself. Their relationship was far from the Hollywood fairy tale so often projected in glossy magazines, but in its imperfection lay its truth. It was not built on spectacle, but on survival. For the press, that endurance made them an enigma. Journalists could not write about wild scandals or messy separations, because there were none. Instead, they speculated about Hackman's legendary temper and his struggle to balance career and home. But to those who knew them privately, the reality was more nuanced. Hackman, though difficult, was also fiercely loyal. Betsy, though tested, was unyielding in her commitment. Together, they forged a partnership that could withstand storms, even if it was never free of them. In later interviews, when Hackman spoke sparingly about his personal life, there was often a hint of humility in his tone. He acknowledged, without elaborate detail, that he was not always easy to live with, that his obsession with work had often pushed love to the margins. Yet by remaining with Betsy, he demonstrated a willingness, perhaps for the first time, to let someone truly stay, to allow companionship to coexist with his relentless pursuit of self-definition. Though their marriage may lack the glittering fairy tale quality Hollywood so often craves, it has endured longer than many celebrity unions combined. For Hackman, who had lost his first marriage to the weight of ambition and conflict, the second act in love was not without turbulence. But it was, in the end, a quieter triumph, one defined not by public display, but by private resilience. If Hackman's personal life was scarred by conflict, his professional life was defined by risk. From the moment he entered Hollywood, he was a man unwilling to be typecast, unwilling to play safe. The greatest leap of his career came in the early 1970s, when he moved from being a reliable character actor to a leading man, an audacious gamble that many in the industry believed he couldn't possibly sustain. Hackman lacked the matinee idol looks of a Newman or Redford. He didn't ooze effortless charm like Cary Grant, nor did he possess the untouchable cool of Steve McQueen. What he had instead was presence, an authenticity so raw that it unsettled audiences even as it fascinated them. That presence crystallized in The French Connection, 1971. Cast as Popeye Doyle, Hackman became the embodiment of a new kind of American hero, or anti-hero. Doyle was not noble nor clean-cut. He was hard-nosed, deeply flawed, and often disturbing in his obsession. Hackman played him without compromise, leaning into the ugliness of the character. Viewers saw a man who bent the law in order to enforce it, whose moral compass wavered as much as the criminals he pursued. This was not a glamorous hero. This was grit, danger, and obsession personified. It was performance as revelation. The gamble paid off. The French Connection exploded, dominating the Academy Awards with 5 wins, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Hackman. Overnight, the man once dismissed as too ordinary to succeed was standing at the very summit of Hollywood. He had become not just a star, but a standard-bearer for a new era of cinema, one that embraced moral ambiguity, realism, and characters that unsettled as much as they entertained. What followed was a string of performances that cemented Hackman's reputation as an actor without limits. In Francis Coppola's The Conversation, 1974, he delivered a masterclass in restraint, portraying a surveillance expert consumed by paranoia. Hackman stripped away all bravado, replacing it with a quiet, suffocating tension that reflected the anxieties of a nation still reeling from Watergate. Then came Superman, 1978, where he shifted gears entirely, playing Lex Luthor with sly wit and theatrical menace. And in Hoosiers, 1986, he gave audiences a deeply human portrayal of a disgraced basketball coach seeking redemption, a performance that captured both toughness and vulnerability. These roles showcased Hackman's remarkable range. He could terrify, charm, and inspire, sometimes within the same film. But even at the height of his fame, Hackman was restless. He was never content to coast on popularity or to recycle formulas that worked. For him, safety was death. That refusal to play safe led him to what many consider his crowning achievement, Unforgiven, 1992. Directed by Clint Eastwood, the film dismantled the romantic mythology of the Western. Hackman played Little Bill Daggett, a sheriff whose brutality hid beneath a mask of order. It was a performance of chilling complexity, part lawman, part tyrant, a man convinced of his righteousness even as he inflicted cruelty. Hackman inhabited the role with terrifying calm, forcing audiences to question where justice ended and corruption began. The result was electrifying. Unforgiven won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Supporting Actor for Hackman. It was a triumph not just of talent, but of willpower. The Marine dropout once told he'd never act had now become the gold standard of American screen acting. With that role, Hackman proved that he was more than a star. He was a legend who could bend entire genres to his will. Fame, as Gene Hackman experienced it, was rarely a comfortable crown. For many stars of his generation, celebrity was a means to validation, an embrace from the public and the industry. For Hackman, it often felt like an intrusion. He never cared to charm journalists or cultivate an air of accessibility. If anything, his honesty was too sharp, too unvarnished, to win him allies in the publicity machine. He did not smile on command, did not feign humility, did not entertain questions that he felt were beneath him. As a result, Hollywood often painted him as difficult, a man whose brilliance on screen was matched by obstinacy off it. The press, in turn, fed on his reputation. Stories abounded of Hackman clashing with directors, of storming off sets, of refusing to repeat takes if he believed he had already given the truth of a scene. These weren't the tantrums of a prima donna, but the stance of a craftsman unwilling to dilute his work for convenience. Yet in the ecosystem of Hollywood, where diplomacy and charisma often mattered as much as talent, Hackman's rigidity was ammunition for gossip columnists. He was labeled gruff, uncooperative, even combative. By the late 1980s, another wave of rumor added fuel to his public image. Hackman, now entering his 50s but still appearing vigorous and camera-ready, became the subject of whispered speculation about plastic surgery. Tabloids ran before and after photos, dissecting lines on his face and speculating on secret procedures. Hackman, predictably, never indulged the chatter. His silence only intensified curiosity, though for him it was simply an extension of his philosophy. The work mattered, not the circus around it. And yet, controversy was only one part of the picture. Away from cameras and red carpets, Hackman had a different identity, one less known and perhaps more authentic. He had no interest in the traditional Hollywood lifestyle of sprawling estates and endless parties. Instead, he invested with the discipline of a Marine and the shrewdness of a strategist. Real estate became his quiet empire. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hackman acquired and developed properties, particularly in New Mexico. The region's vast landscapes and rugged independence appealed to him. It was a place where he could vanish into normalcy, where the noise of Hollywood couldn't find him. These investments weren't flamboyant. They were steady, practical, and grounded. Hackman built wealth not through extravagance, but through foresight. For a man once consumed by financial struggle, who had lived through debts and lawsuits that nearly crippled him, these ventures represented stability, a kind of safety net he had never known in his early years. Yet even business was not his final word. In a twist few expected, Hackman embarked on a second career that revealed another side of his restless mind: writing. Alongside undersea archaeologist Daniel Lenihan, Hackman co-authored several novels, beginning with Wake of the Perdido Star in 1999. The book, a sweeping nautical adventure, surprised critics with its depth of research and narrative momentum. It wasn't a vanity project. Hackman immersed himself in the discipline of fiction, laboring over plot structures, character arcs, and historical detail. Further novels followed: Justice for None, a Depression-era thriller, and Escape from Andersville, a Civil War tale that cemented his reputation as a serious storyteller. While the books never climbed to literary heights of Pulitzer acclaim, they earned commercial respect and a loyal readership. In the eyes of many, Hackman proved that reinvention was possible, even in the later stages of life. He had already conquered cinema. Now he turned to the written word, demonstrating the same commitment that had once driven him to master acting. The contrast was striking. On screen, Hackman was the embodiment of intensity, a man whose performances seemed carved out of steel. On the page, however, his imagination roamed through history, weaving narratives of survival, morality, and human conflict. In many ways, his novels echoed the very qualities that defined his acting: an obsession with flawed men, harsh environments, and the moral ambiguities of survival. Hackman's refusal to be trapped in one identity set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He was not content to be just an actor, no matter how successful. The same drive that had carried him from a Marine dropout to a two-time Academy Award winner now propelled him to explore uncharted territory. Fame gave him freedom, and Hackman used that freedom not to indulge, but to expand. In the end, controversy never defined him, nor did the press's caricatures. They were noise, background chatter to a life built on risk, reinvention, and resilience. For Hackman, the true measure of success wasn't in headlines or handshakes. It was in the ability to shape his own destiny, whether through a groundbreaking film, a shrewd property deal, or a story committed to the page. Though Gene Hackman has not suffered the shattering grief of losing a spouse, he has lived through a slower, more relentless kind of loss: the erosion of time. For Hackman, the 21st century brought with it not just the natural quieting of his career, but the hollowing absence of friends, rivals, and collaborators who had once defined his world. The Hollywood of his youth, the fiercely competitive, artist-driven world of the 1960s and 1970s, was steadily disappearing, leaving behind ghosts and headlines. When Richard Harris passed in 2002, Hackman reportedly felt it like a personal wound. Harris, with his booming presence and wild spirit, had embodied the kind of fearless artistry Hackman admired. Marlon Brando's death in 2004 struck a different chord. Brando, the rebel who had redefined American acting, was a titan to Hackman's generation, the North Star against which so many measured themselves. Losing him was not simply the passing of a man, it was the end of a cultural era. Then in 2008, Paul Newman, Hackman's peer, friend, and occasional rival, succumbed to cancer. Newman was more than a contemporary. He was a reminder of a time when acting was a craft pursued for depth, not just box office numbers. His death left Hackman unusually subdued. The competitive fire softened into reflection. Every obituary was like a mirror held up to Hackman's own life. Every tribute forced him to reckon with mortality, to measure not only what he had accomplished, but what he had lost along the way. Hollywood, once buzzing with their shared ambitions, seemed quieter, emptier. For a man who had spent so much of his career in battle, with directors, with the press, even with himself, the steady drumbeat of death left him reflective, even vulnerable. Hackman was never a man eager to share his inner world, but as he aged, he began to acknowledge regrets. In interviews, when coaxed by persistent journalists, he admitted to missing out on time with his children. His obsession with work, the endless hours on set, and the emotional exhaustion he carried home had built walls between him and family life. He confessed with rare openness that he had sometimes let his temper destroy friendships, and that bridges once burned were never rebuilt. These weren't the dramatic tragedies of a scandal-ridden star. They were the quieter, more insidious wounds of a man who gave everything to his craft and realized too late what it had cost him. The weight of those choices grew heavier as the years passed. Friends faded not only from death, but from distance, and Hackman, who had built his career on toughness, struggled to live with the softer truths of vulnerability. He was not invincible nor immune to loneliness. By the time he retired from acting in the mid-2000s, Hackman seemed to retreat deliberately into a quieter existence. New Mexico became his sanctuary, a place where he could rise with the sun, right at his desk, and watch the horizon without the press breathing down his neck. Here, he was not Gene Hackman, two-time Academy Award winner. He was simply a man growing old, reflecting on the arc of his life. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, the kind of man who would chat briefly at the local cafe but never linger long enough for small-town gossip. Yet even in retreat, the past followed him. Every film anniversary, every tribute to a fallen peer, pulled him back into the public eye, reminding him of the community he once belonged to and the faces no longer there. The names on the in-memorial reels grew more familiar, until Hackman himself seemed one of the last pillars standing from that extraordinary generation of uncompromising artists. And perhaps it is in that survival, staying alive while others faded, that Hackman wrestled with his deepest truths. Toughness had carried him through poverty, rejection, and Hollywood's unforgiving machine. But in his later years, toughness was not always enough. Vulnerability crept in, not as weakness, but as honesty. It showed in the way he spoke of missed moments, the wistfulness when recalling friends long gone, and the quiet acceptance that legacies are not built only on awards or performances, but on the people we hold close. For Hackman, the twilight of life has not been defined by scandal or collapse, but by contemplation. He has lived long enough to see his generation vanish around him, long enough to reckon with the personal cost of ambition, and long enough to understand that toughness, while invaluable on the screen, cannot shield the heart forever. In 2004, Gene Hackman made an announcement that stunned Hollywood. He was retiring from acting. No farewell tour of roles, no swan song engineered for Oscars, no desperate clinging to the screen that had defined him for 4 decades. He walked away, abruptly, decisively, and with the same blunt force that had defined his life. At 74 years old, he seemed to vanish from the stage that had made him immortal. Yet Hackman's retreat from the screen was not an ending. It was a metamorphosis. For the first time since he was a teenager running from home, Hackman chose quiet over chaos, discipline over survival, and authorship over performance. In that silence, he revealed something startling. Gene Hackman, the gruff, indomitable actor, was also a storyteller. Teaming with Daniel Lenihan, a marine archaeologist, Hackman began writing novels. Their collaboration seemed unlikely on the surface, but in truth, it was perfect. Hackman brought to the table a lifetime of observing human nature, of embodying flawed men on screen with ruthless honesty. Lenihan offered the historical grounding, the technical expertise, and a world of forgotten shipwrecks and dangerous frontiers. Together, they created narratives that were muscular, vivid, and deeply alive. Their first offering, Wake of the Perdido Star, 1999, was a swashbuckling maritime adventure set in the early 1800s. Though released while Hackman was still acting, it foreshadowed his coming reinvention. The novel revealed an instinct for pacing, character conflict, and atmosphere, skills honed not in a classroom, but across decades of dissecting screenplays and living inside roles. Critics were cautious at first, skeptical of an actor-turned-author, but the book found its audience. Readers praised its grit, its attention to detail, and its sense of danger. The pair followed with Justice for None, 2004, a Depression-era noir that showed Hackman's affinity for morally complex men. Later works, including Escape from Andersonville, 2008, and Pursuit, 2013, cemented his reputation as more than a celebrity dabbling in fiction. Hackman was no hobbyist, he was a craftsman. His novels were not mere curiosities with a famous name on the cover. They were serious works that demonstrated narrative skill, emotional weight, and an uncompromising sense of justice and fate. For Hackman, writing was more than a pastime. It was a form of reinvention that carried the same defiance as his acting. Just as he had rejected Hollywood glamour to play raw, imperfect men, he rejected the Hollywood expectation of decline. Retirement did not mean irrelevance. Creativity, he proved, had no expiration date. His novels allowed him to explore new terrains of imagination, far from the lights of Los Angeles, while still engaging the instincts that had made him great: tension, conflict, moral ambiguity. Unlike many actors who struggle in their twilight years, reduced to cameos, nostalgia tours, or self-parody, Hackman's transformation carried dignity. He closed one chapter with finality and opened another with purpose. For his fans, it was bittersweet. They would no longer see him on screen, but they could still hear his voice in the written word. For Hackman himself, it was liberation. He had proven once again that the critics were wrong, that the boy told he would never act, the actor accused of being too difficult, could master yet another art form on his own terms. This was Hackman's ultimate comeback, not a desperate lunge back into the spotlight, but a quiet triumph of reinvention. He became not just a survivor of Hollywood's brutal churn, but a model of how to outwit it. In retirement, he was not diminished, he was reborn. Today, Gene Hackman resides in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place of vast skies, quiet streets, and the kind of solitude he spent a lifetime fighting to earn. Far removed from Hollywood's bright lights and perpetual scandals, Hackman's life in his 90s is one of deliberate peace. The man once defined by grit, tension, and intensity now spends his mornings cycling the rugged desert roads, painting in his studio, or sitting in the stillness of the high desert surrounded by landscapes that echo the stark simplicity he always craved. His marriage to Betsy Arakawa has become his anchor. After decades of turbulence in his personal life, their bond endures as a rare constant. Friends who know Hackman speak of a man softened, not weakened, but tempered, as iron is tempered by fire. He rarely grants interviews, and when he does, his words carry the finality of a man with little left to prove. There is no hunger for attention, no desire to resurrect his image. Every sentence he speaks feels like a distillation of years of battles fought and lessons learned. His physical vitality remains startling for his age. The cycling, the painting, the quiet rituals of a man who has outlasted his peers all reveal the discipline that carried him from poverty to Hollywood immortality. Yet what defines his later years is not activity, but perspective. Hackman has seen too much, the betrayals, the wars of ego, the fleeting nature of fame, to waste time on trivialities. He does not chase trends or nostalgia. Instead, he exists in the rare space between past and present, a man who lived fully and then walked away without apology. His legacy, however, does not rest quietly in the background. Hackman's name remains carved into the bedrock of American cinema. His performances are studied in film schools, his characters invoked in conversations about the greatest screen portrayals of all time. He is not remembered for vanity projects or celebrity stunts. He is remembered for the way he stripped acting of glamour and replaced it with truth. When audiences watched Hackman, they did not see a Hollywood star. They saw human beings, raw and imperfect, rendered with frightening honesty. Consider Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, a detective both heroic and corrupted who chased criminals with the same fury he turned inward. Or his Lex Luthor in Superman, a villain played with such intelligence and charisma that he transcended comic book caricature. Or Unforgiven's Little Bill Daggett, a lawman whose brutality forced audiences to question the very nature of justice. These were performances built not to charm, they were built to endure. Hackman's story resonates because it is not the tale of an easy climb or a charmed career. It is the tale of a boy abandoned by his father, dismissed by teachers, and scorned by acting coaches, who nevertheless rose, through defiance and discipline, to the summit of Hollywood. And when he arrived there, he had the audacity to leave on his own terms. That refusal to cling to relevance, to bow before an industry that devours its own, may be the most radical act of all. As the credits roll on Gene Hackman's extraordinary life, one truth remains unshakable. He is not merely a star of his time. He is an immortal. A reminder that greatness comes not from polish or charm, but from courage. The courage to be imperfect, to be unyielding, and to never look back. In the end, Gene Hackman's journey is more than Hollywood history. It is a lesson in life itself. He reminds us that success does not belong to the loudest voice or the smoothest path, but to those who endure. He teaches us that greatness is not perfection. It is persistence, honesty, and the courage to reinvent yourself even when the world doubts you. Hackman's story whispers a truth we all know but often forget. No matter where you begin, no matter how many people tell you you can't, discipline and determination can rewrite destiny. His life is proof that you don't need to chase the spotlight to matter. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is built in silence, through integrity, through choices made on your own terms. And as time moves on, his work remains, urging us to live boldly, to stand firm, and above all, to never be afraid of walking away when the story has been told. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Gene Hackman, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to American Spotlight, your home for powerful stories that celebrate the legends who shaped our world.